What are you optimizing for is a project that is all about the goals of recommender systems. Now, you may not be familiar with the term recommender systems, but you've probably used several of them today. Recommender systems are the pieces of software that filter the enormous amount of information, products, jobs, listings of all sorts down to the small number that you actually see in any particular day. Now, if you've used recommender systems, you probably have some complaints about them, and you're not alone. We have a basic problem that recommender systems are not really optimizing for the right thing. So you've probably heard this critique that engagement leads to all sorts of bad outcomes. So things like addiction, maybe, or showing people extreme content that gets them to watch, but isn't actually healthy for them in society. So if chasing clicks is not the right thing, what is? And that's the question that the What Are You Optimizing For project is trying to answer. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour of what the current state of recommender system design is, the interesting things people are starting to do to try to fix this, and even into a little bit into what the future holds and what an entirely different generation of recommendation systems might do. So there's a lot of problems with optimizing for some single specific thing. You may be familiar with some of the discussion around this, for example, from Stuart Russell's recent book, Human Compatible. And people have made lists of this, right? And we're not just talking about optimization by the machine. Most AI technology is based on optimizing for something, but also optimization by the organization that is building the system, right? So you are looking at metrics like engagement if you're building a news recommendation system. And this type of optimization has side effects, and not just on the people using the system, but potentially on other people as well. So my favorite example is a traffic routing system might end up bringing congestion to neighborhoods that were previously calm and safe for children to play in the street. The way that I like to think about metrics is as a hierarchy, right? So you have, at the top of this, you have sort of very high level principles, actual outcomes of people in the world. So things like well-being or agency. Sort of in the middle, you have things that you could say apply to individual recommendations. So for example, you could look at what Google News is showing you today and say, is there a diversity of sources or a diversity of viewpoints here today? Or you could ask, for example, if Amazon is recommending these certain products, what is the carbon footprint or the environmental cost of buying those products? But most actual work on recommendation systems is done at the level of available data. Now, there's nothing wrong with using available data algorithmically. I mean, you can't use data that you don't have, but often there's a gap in both the thinking about what this available data is actually trying to get at, right? So you can use things like likes and shares as proxies for information quality, but unless you're actually thinking about it in terms of information quality and not clicks, you may not be managing the system appropriately. The other missing thing is, of course, you can go out and get more data. You can directly measure things like user well-being, and a few organizations are starting to do so. So I'm going to sort of walk through a real-world example of an organization, in this case Facebook, trying to incorporate some of these higher-level human outcome metrics in their system. So well-being. Probably all of you have heard the phrase well-being, maybe you use it colloquially. What you may not know is that it has been developed as a particular school of thought. It's sort of, it's a very old idea, right? How can we tell whether someone is living a good life or not? And in the past few decades, people working in psychology and governance and public policy have really sort of dialed in on maybe not sort of the philosophically perfect definition of well-being, but a useful definition of well-being that corresponds to how people actually make life choices. And so this is what a well-being survey actually looks like. This is a survey put together by the OECD, so it's this data is actually collected across the OECD countries. And the main thing you ask is, overall, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? So this is, asks someone to think about not how you're feeling in the moment. There's other questions for that, as you can see near the bottom here. But how do you feel about your life as a whole? Now, in late 2017, Facebook started thinking about well-being. And in fact, the phrase well-being started to appear in blog posts and other discussions from Facebook about what they were doing. And Facebook was reacting in part to research that showed that social media could be either good or bad for well-being. So social media can be good for your well-being if you're using it actively, right? You're making connections to friends, you're going to events, you're interacting with people, and maybe bad for well-being if it's more like television, right? It's sort of the endless scroll, the endless passive scroll. And maybe you're doing social comparison. You're looking at all these people living this amazing life, and that is making you feel bad. So they wanted to encourage active use because they thought that that would improve the well-being of their users. But it's difficult to measure well-being directly. And so instead, they went after this concept called meaningful social interactions. So what this ends up actually being is they use their user panel test. It's an ongoing survey with thousands of users. And it says, did you have a meaningful interaction as either on or off of Facebook as a result of something you saw on Facebook? And so they incorporated this feedback directly into the algorithm. So here's this survey I was talking about. They go ask these people, and they actually built a machine learning model to predict whether any particular post would result in a meaningful interaction or not. And so that became part of how they rank items in the newsfeed and also in other products like video. And ultimately, this led to outcomes that you can observe, or at least Facebook can observe, like engagement, and some unobserved changed on user well-being. Interestingly, Facebook did this even though it cost them engagement in the short term. So this is, I find interesting because it's evidence that large companies will make these changes even if they have a short-term cost. Okay, so now we come to the good news and the bad news. The good news is that a company made the choice to optimize for user well-being, figured out a way to do it using social science methods, and actually changed their algorithm. And by looking at the drop in engagement, you can say it was actually a pretty major change, right? It wasn't some tiny little thing. The bad news is we have no transparency. We have no idea how this turned out. We had no idea if it had a big effect, no effect, or even a bad effect on users. So it's the beginning of something, let's say. So working with this idea that we can use these human outcome metrics to build better recommendation systems, what other types of metrics could we use? So I'm going to give you a couple other examples of things that have actually been done and some hypothetical examples as well. YouTube has been dabbling in human outcome metrics or socially responsible metrics. They've talked about a metric called responsibility. Unfortunately, we don't know anything about what it's actually comprised of other than that, which includes data from user satisfaction surveys. So here's what these surveys look like. They ask after showing someone a video, what did you think of that, right? Was it a good recommendation or not? Now, I've never seen Uh-Oh Sneaky Monkey, but apparently it is life-changing, so you should go check it out. The idea here is that you might get more accurate information if you ask someone to look backwards. So maybe, you watched 10 hours of television, it sort of sucked you in, but the next day you're like, oh man, that was kind of a waste of my day. Why did I do that? And the idea of looking backwards has a long history in philosophy and psychology. So you may have heard of System 1 and System 2. You may have heard of this concept in political philosophy of reflective equilibrium, right? The decision you make after you think about it for a while. Or if you've come from the AI alignment world, you may have heard of this idea of coherent extrapolated volition. It's all the sort of same idea of looking back and the idea that that's going to be more accurate. And so they actually last year released a paper where they talk about how it fits into their overall recommendation system. Don't worry too much about the exact design of this thing. The main point is that this user satisfaction survey is one of the things they are literally optimizing for. Spotify is also optimizing for some interesting stuff. They're concerned about diversity, and after a bunch of sort of internal deliberation about what does it mean for a playlist to be diverse, they said, well, it should contain songs from different levels of popularity. And so they found that they could actually make their recommendations more diverse. So on the bottom diagram, going to the left, without reducing the user satisfaction score too much, right? So they could expand people's musical tastes without showing them stuff they didn't like. But we could go even farther. So you could imagine a recommendation system, maybe for Amazon, that took into account the carbon footprints of the product it was trying to sell you. So going back to one of these sort of system diagrams here, the idea here is that if you can build a database of the carbon footprints for each product, then Amazon could recommend to you products that kind of do the same thing, right? They're sort of equivalent from the user's point of view, but have a lower carbon footprint. So far so good, right? And we now have a very general method for incorporating our human values, right? There are things that we as humans care about, and with appropriate choice of metrics, we can incorporate many different types of values. The bad news is we're still not talking about inclusive AI. Why do a bunch of engineers and researchers, people like me basically, get to decide what the internet is like for everyone else? And so the next phase of this, and now we're moving from the present to the future, is design techniques for building recommenders that are much more inclusive. So here's the basic idea. We've been talking so far about better metrics. That is the near-term focus of the what are you optimizing for project. Where we'd like to do is don't drive the system with metrics at all. I should be able to just tell you what I want, right? All of these users on whose behalf we are trying to pick good metrics should be able to just say what it is that they want the recommender to do. So there's some early experimental work on this with recommendation systems where rather than just showing you a bunch of items and having you click on one, you can just tell it, yeah, I'm seeing all of this footwear, but what I want is blue boots. And then the next round of recommendations that come up will be blue boots. And it sort of seems very natural, right? Why can't I just control Facebook or Google News or Amazon or LinkedIn or any of this stuff just by sort of telling it what I want and how to alter the recommendations to better suit me? The catch is people have opinions not only on what gets recommended to them, but what gets recommended to everyone else. And you can see this in things like the dislike button. You can see this in all of the ways that content is reported. You can see it in all of like online campaigns to vote up or down certain things, or like or reshare or make something go viral. And you can see it in the political discussions about what should and should not be on platforms. So it's not enough to just sort of say, we're going to give users individually what they want. We have to solve the social choice problem of different people with different interests and ideas of what should be on a platform. And in fact, all recommender systems are multi-stakeholder systems. We normally just think of the user and maybe the system operator as having certain interests. So the user wants, relevant products, the system operator wants to sell things. But in many systems, there are other stakeholders, such as the creators. So the people who are creating music that goes on Spotify, or who are putting up things to sell on Amazon. And also the other users, right? If I upvote something, you see it more as well, potentially. And also non-users, as in my consumption of a product with a high carbon footprint can affect you and potentially everyone in the world. So the recommender design problem is not just about giving individual users what they want, but about balancing all of these multiple needs against each other. And there's some interesting work that goes in this direction. So there's an experiment called We Build AI, where they were actually building a volunteer food delivery service where you pick up food from like a supermarket that would throw it out, and volunteer drivers drive it to like a food bank. And they wanted to sort of figure out a system to vote on like who should pick up the food and drive it where. And what they actually did is they worked with individual stakeholders, so drivers, donors who funded the operation, the supermarkets who had the food, the recipients, to collectively sort of work out their preferences and what they say, build a computational model that embodies their belief, right? And then all of these sort of individual, you can think of them as sort of like digital proxies for what I believe the right answer is, collectively vote. So I'm not saying this is how Facebook should work. It's a bit complicated for that. But there's a bunch of experimentation really grappling with this problem of how do you build an algorithm that fairly takes into account the preferences of lots of different people. And in fact, this is what the next paper coming out of the What Are You Optimizing For project at PI is talking about. We're trying to move from trying to optimize these like individual objective functions and picking the right metric and all this stuff to systems that can directly learn using very natural human interfaces and intrinsically balance the needs and desires of multiple people. And so this is what that would look like ultimately. I should be able to just tell YouTube to remind me to finish the online video I'm watching, or ask somebody who's selling me things, can I buy products that are more environmentally friendly? Or get my phone to help me with an addiction to a game that is taking up too much of my time. Or even ultimately, if social media is making me sad, I should be able to tell it to adjust. I should be able to make the software adjust to me rather than me adjusting to the computer. So this is the big vision, right? Ultimately where we want to go. And we start with metrics because metrics is where everything how all of this is managed today. But ultimately we are trying to work towards much more intelligent multi-stakeholder recommendation systems. All right, thanks for your time. If any part of this is interesting to you, please get in touch. Thanks so much.